In this tutorial we're going to look at creating a link between Visual Basic and an Access database. Using Visual Basic to create a form that's going to be the front end for an Access database. I'm going to use a simple database as an example, which is just which contains a single table, which is a contact list, a name and address book if you like. And we're going to create a form that allows us to display all the details of all the contacts in the address book and to edit and change them. Why would you use Visual Basic for this? Because obviously if you've got Access, you've got all the functions where you could access a table, maintain the data, etc. The advantage of using Visual Basic as a front end for Access, firstly you could distribute the program and an Access database, and the users you distribute the program to do not need to have their own copy of Access, so that'll save them quite a bit of money. You can just distribute it as a program and a database, and they can just run it free of charge. And secondly, in Visual Basic there's quite a lot more functionality in the program you can use to do things like validation and selecting data, etc. We're not going to look at that in this tutorial. We're just going to look at how to link the Access database to Visual Basic. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to create a Windows form application. I'm using Visual Studio 2010. If you're using 2012, most of the screens will look the same. There's really no difference in functionality once you're in it. So let's just give it a name. So I'm just going to call this Access Database Work. This is an example. I've selected Windows Form Application at the top. I press OK. And we give it a moment or two, and we should come up with our form. Hopefully running quicker on your computer than it is on mine. Okay, the first thing is, if you don't see them on your version of Visual Studio, is we want to find there is a screen which we want to bring up, so we want to click on the data menu and we want to add a new data source. This is where we tell Visual Studio that what our data source is, where the Access database is, and how we want to connect to it. I come up with some prompts, a little wizard, so I'm going to step through this. Right, the application will get the data from a database. Just click next. What we want to use is a data set, so that's basically what we're going to do is pulling different tables from the actual one, and we're going to get the wizard to just identify the tables in the Access database for us. Click next. Click on New Connection. New Connection will give us a link to the database. It comes up with a variety of data sources. In this tutorial, let's keep it simple. We're just going to use Access. Press Continue. So we've now told Visual Studio we want to connect to a database, and the database is Access, and it's got the software in Visual Studio to carry out that connection for us. Now we need to find the database we want to connect to, and let's make a shortcut. So wherever you've downloaded the database to, the folder you've got it in, you need to navigate to that, and then you just select on there and press open. Okay, at this point there's no password set up on this particular database, so I'm just going to say test connection. So Visual Studio will test, and it's come back and said it's connected OK to the database. So we press OK to this. And then we click next again. Comes up this prompt. I won't go into details of what this is about. We're just going to say no. We want Visual Studio to create a link to the single version, the actual single copy we've got of the database. So I'm just going to say no to that. Everything else is okay here. Okay, next thing it does is the wizard's gone, open up the database, and it's telling us how many tables there are in it. If you click on this arrow here, now I said this is a very simple database we're connected to. It's only got one table. If you've got a series of tables but you didn't want to access all of them, then you would just select individual tables that you want. In this particular case, selecting the table icon at the top. In other words, to select all the tables is the same as selecting one of them. We just press finish. Okay, so now Visual Studio's established the connection to the database. We want to get the data displayed onto the form. Now I know the rows are going to take up a bit of space, so I'm just going to widen my form a little. If in your version, when you're using Visual Studio, if you haven't opened up a data source before, you may need to go Data and Show Data Sources, and you get the panel on the left, the Data Sources panel, which is a new panel that we haven't used before. A number of things you can do on this particular panel. If I click the arrow here, it shows me all the fields, all the columns if you like, that are in my table. In later tutorials I'll show how you can actually bring each of these over as an individual control on the form, and you can manipulate and control them using Visual Basic, but for the moment we're just going to handle the whole table. I'm going to use it as a single data set. So I'm on the table, I've selected the table at the top, and I'm going to click here, Data Grid View. So basically whatever I do with the table, I'm going to get the data grid view with it. And just as we used to drag the controls onto a form, I've just dragged the data grid over here. You can see down the bottom of the screen that Visual Studio has put in a number of different controls down the bottom, which we won't worry about, but they're all the ones we need for the connection to the database. And what I'm going to do is just edit my data set. Now if I widen the control a little, you can see that all the fields in the table are shown. They're not going to quite all fit on the screen, and I don't need to seal these fields. So what I'm going to do now is, if I click on this arrow at the top here, I can actually change some of the settings for this data grid view. First of all, I'm going to edit columns. I'm going to get rid of some columns. I don't need the ID column displayed. You always need to select it for a database, but I don't need to display it, so I'm going to remove that, because that's just an auto number that Access is going to use, so it's really of no interest to the user. It's just happening in the background. First name, surname, yes, I'll keep that. Address line 1, don't really need address line 2 in this case, I'm just going to get rid of them. Okay, at that point I've probably got the fields I want, so let's have a look at it. Okay, once again I know the notes field is longer than that, so I want a little bit more room in that notes field at the end. So I'm going to click back on the arrow at the top, go back to edit the columns. Now if I click on notes on the side here, it shows me the properties for the field I'm looking at, and I can increase down the bottom here. I'm just going to increase, I'm just going to double the size of the width of the column, and let's have a look again. So now we've got a little bit more room there, and let's just push this over. I'll just get rid of that so I can see where I am. And let's see how much we can get displayed. It's bigger than I thought. Okay, so now I should have all my data shown on screen. I'm just going to press the play button, see what we've got. So now the program is being generated, and the program will already have the code built in without us having to write a single line of VB code to access the table. So now I've got a Visual Basic program which is connected to a data source, which is my Access database, and the contents of the table are actually shown, and I can edit and add things into the particular fields. At the moment I haven't put any validation or anything behind it, but I could do that in Visual Basic, and I can actually create and navigate between different fields on the database. All changes you can make, you need to press the save button when you've made all the changes, and they will actually be saved back to the Access database. A few other things you can do before we finish up. If there's a large amount of records in the database, then sometimes it's useful to display the alternate records. So if you had 100 records and they're shown on a grid format, it's sometimes difficult to see the difference between them, and you can actually look at some of these properties on the right here and change the way the database will look, or the data grid will display data. So for example, this one is for alternate rows. I can actually change the background color so that every other row will have a different color in my grid. It's just easier to identify things. You can change things like the column heading sizes and the text using the properties, but I'll let you play with those in your own time. So now we've got a simple database application. No VB code which is required at the moment, but we can put code behind it, and we're able to access and maintain an Access database without using Access itself.